The crystal flutes chimed before I said a word. A bright clink of glass on glass that carried across the white marble room. Morning poured through Elliston's floor-to-ceiling windows, slicking every surface with winter light that made our reflections look sharper colder. My mother's pearls flashed when she turned her head. Her eyes swept me from shoes to shoulder seam, and the corner of her mouth hitched into that practiced, pitying smile I knew better than my own. "You're lucky we even include you," she murmured, just loud enough to count. "Pity goes a long way." The air inside my chest didn't move. A server hovered close enough to catch the sentence, and then pretend he hadn't. My father adjusted his cufflinks as if the fabric, not the words, had snagged. James kept scrolling on his phone. Amanda stayed very still, the way deer freeze when they think no one will notice them if they don't breathe. I reached for the water glass because my hands needed a simple, quiet job. Condensation slicked my fingers. The glass met the linen with a soft tick that sounded final. Outside, white runners traced the paths through Millennium Park. Inside, I kept my spine long, my face neutral, and tasted the metallic edge of the moment like a coin on the tongue. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever been treated like you were lucky just to be tolerated, hit that like button and share this with someone who'll understand. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. To understand how that one sentence rearranged my life, you need to know what came before it. I grew up in Lake Forest in a stone house that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread about tasteful success. The lawn lines were arrow straight, the hydrangeas a shade of blue my mother claimed the neighbors could never quite achieve. My father Thomas brought buildings out of drawings and into the Chicago skyline. People said his name with the kind of respect that leans forward. At our dining table, he leaned back. He'd ask about our grades like he was scanning a quarterly report assign, praise to James notes to me, and silence to anything that wasn't a measurable win. My mother Diane curated our lives the way she curated centerpieces. She believed good posture could change a person's fortune. She believed a spotless foyer could redeem any sin. She believed a daughter who spoke softly and smiled at the right moments was the highest form of etiquette. I learned early that there were two Carols, the one I had to be to get through the evening, and the one I quietly was when I closed my bedroom door. James came first, and never let any of us forget it. He was the heir by personality, as much as birth order, big laugh, broad gestures, a talent for landing on his feet. Amanda arrived 5 years after me, gentle by training, agreeable by survival. If my mother had a favorite verb, it was presentable. If my father had a favorite question, it was, "What about your math grade?" When I won the regional spelling bee in 4th grade, the shiny paper medal pressed cold against my neck while I read the empty seats where my parents should have been. They were at James's football game. When I opened the admission letter from the University of Chicago with a partial scholarship, my father nodded and asked why I hadn't chosen Northwestern like James. When I brought home my first real paycheck, my mother lifted it between 2 manicured fingers, smiled, and said, "Sweetie, interior design would suit you. Less stress." My grandmother Eleanor was the exception, the soft chair in a house that prized hard edges. She kept a cabin on a Michigan lake pine timbers and screened porch, the kind of place where the deck boards warmed under bare feet. She'd brew tea in a chipped white kettle and ask the kind of questions that let me fill the silence in between. "You are stronger than you know," she'd write in a looping hand across the tops of recipe cards she pretended were for me to cook and not to keep. The summer I turned 29, she moved her trembling signature across a deed and handed me the folder, eyes clear, voice steady. "For the one who loves it for what it is." No one else knew. I let the family use the place and quietly paid the taxes myself, because sometimes Love looks like allowing the myth to live a little longer. I built a career that wasn't the one my mother pictured, and wasn't the one my father could understand, but it was mine. I learned the rhythm of strategy calls and client pitches, the weight of payroll Fridays, and the relief of signed contracts. I led a small, bright team that believed in sustainable brands and clean briefs and the dignity of leaving work on time. My grandmother never met my office. I still picture her sitting in that porch rocker, nodding like she hears the sound of my life turning. The morning of the brunch, the sky above Michigan Avenue was the color of brushed steel. Elliston's hostess offered the smile reserved for names on the right list. My mother had booked the best table always by the window, always facing the room. I arrived at 10:59. Because my mother says punctuality is respect, and then punishes you for seeming too eager. "Good of you to join us," she said, noting the second hand of an invisible watch. Her cream knit jacket was the precise shade of money. "Black coffee," I told the server, because I wanted the day to be clear around the edges. James ordered a mimosa he would call mandatory because of the restaurant's reputation. Amanda adjusted her floral dress and then her engagement ring the size of a raindrop, as if both needed equal attention. The small talk ran its grooves. My mother's commentary on my jeans, my father's gaze sliding past me to the menu, as if it were a report dense enough to justify his attention, James's confident monologue about an acquisition I'd already seen numbers for and knew wasn't the victory he was selling. The light cut across the tablecloth and made a bright trapezoid that stopped just short of my plate. "Now the real reason we're here," my father announced, setting down his empty flute with a final corporate click. "Sullivan Properties is acquiring the Lakefront Tower Complex. James will lead development." The word lead hung in the air like a fresh coat of paint. I told my face to look pleased. My father didn't look to see if I was. And my mother added voice, soft and grand, "We should celebrate at the cabin for the 4th. A proper family week." She said the cabin the way other people say our church, and I felt the familiar slide in my stomach that wasn't fear so much as fatigue. "The deck needs repair," I said evenly. The lakeside section took a beating in that last storm. 4 sets of eyes rolled with the precision of synchronized swimmers. "Oh, Carol," my mother sighed, turning to the server to ask for lemon like she was correcting the entire tone of the morning. Always worried about silly details. "It stood for 50 years. My father lifted his hand without looking up. "Hire someone if it's necessary and send the estimate to James for approval." Something small and bright clicked in my chest. Approval? For a property that belonged to me. I must have let the thought show because my mother's smile sharpened. She tilted her head, pearls resting against the shallow of her collarbone. "What is it now?" "Carol, you always get that look when you overthink simple things." "It's nothing," I said, because that's the training that keeps peace in public. "We should do repairs sooner rather than later." Her gaze softened into the expression she saved for strangers at charity luncheons and for me in rooms like this. "You're lucky we even include you," she said, with that pleasant, pitying cadence. "Pity goes a long way." The table paused as if the building itself had inhaled. James's phone hovered over the linen. Amanda's hand stalled on her water glass. My father reread the specials he had already memorized. I lifted my coffee, tasted the dark, clean bitterness, and set the cup down without a sound. My mother blinked, startled, not by her sentence, but by the way it didn't land. "Is something funny?" she asked, brittle around the edges. "The coffee's excellent," I said, and it was. We finished a meal none of us would have remembered if not for the sentence that split the morning in two. I handed my card to the server with my father's and thanked the hostess by name on my way out, because kindness is a habit that makes me feel like myself, even when the room tries to erase me. Outside, the wind off the lake pushed through Michigan Avenue like it had someplace urgent to be. I walked to the garage under my building, the kind of modern tower my mother had once called surprisingly nice for you, and rode the elevator to the 12th floor, where the light always seems like late afternoon because of how the lake throws it back. The door clicked shut behind me with that quiet apartment sound that always feels like a choice. I toed off my shoes and crossed to the window wall, where December water wore a broken sheet of sun. A runner traced the path below, hands tucked head down, the rhythm of someone who knows how to keep moving. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I didn't call anyone. I stood very still and listened to the silence to see what it had to say. Somewhere in that stillness, a memory rose, a kitchen table at the cabin, my grandmother's hand covering mine, the kettle starting its slow rattle on the burner. You are stronger than you know. I could smell pine sap warming on the porch boards, hear the gift of loons at dusk. The memory didn't ache the way it used to. It steadied. In the office, I set my laptop on the oak desk that has a ring where a coffee mug once forgot its place. The screen lit my hands. Folders sat in neat rows, because order is the way I calm the weather inside me. I opened the one no one else has ever seen, the one I labeled family, because naming a thing is another way to hold it steady. Numbers never flinch. They tell their story straight through. My father's accounts, my mother's cards, the trust ledgers, the alerts I receive when balances tip into territory that makes my shoulders tense. The cabin deed, the taxes I paid from my own accounts, because I wanted the place to feel clean of obligation. The spreadsheet of charges that rose and fell like a low tide of small, thoughtless thefts. Client dinners that were first dates. Office supplies that came in branded shopping bags. Flights I didn't take to cities I've never visited. I watched the columns fill the screen like a horizon I knew I could depend on. Then I closed the laptop without saving anything new, because tonight wasn't for decisions. It was for seeing clearly. The room darkened slowly. Streetlights blinked on below, laying tiny necklaces of white across the boulevard. My phone hummed once with a message I didn't check. I set the kettle on the good one that clicks like the lid on my grandmother's old pot. Steam lifted, curled, disappeared. I poured the water, pressed the tea bag with the back of a spoon, and took the mug to the window. Across the lake, a freighter moved like a thought you almost miss if you're not paying attention. My reflection in the glass was the same as it had been at noon, but the air inside my chest finally moved. Not big gulps, not sobs, just breath steady and ordinary like a metronome set to a sensible tempo. I stood there until the tea went lukewarm and the light outside settled into full winter night. When I turned off the kitchen lamp, the apartment fell into a soft dark that didn't feel lonely. Somewhere below, a siren lifted and faded. Somewhere above, someone laughed a muffled burst that sounded like a life happening a few floors away. I set my empty mug in the sink and rinsed away the tea stain before it could set. My phone lit the counter. A new group chat message flashed my mother's name, then James's, then my father's, stacked notifications marching like a drumline. I watched them arrive without reaching a quiet curiosity growing where the old dread used to live. The messages kept stacking. I let them. At the window, the freighter's starboard light slipped past the edge of my view and was gone. I pressed my palm to the cool glass and listened to the hum of the building around me, a low reassurance that steel and concrete can hold. Somewhere very far off and very near, I felt the small hinge of the day give way. I didn't know what tomorrow would ask of me. I only knew I would answer it in my own voice. The phone buzzed again, insistent this time, my mother's tone, even through text, urgent corrective sure of the shape of my compliance. I let it buzz once more, then reached out not for the phone, but for the switch that turned the room to darkness, leaving only the lake and the city lights. In the quiet, the last thought slid into place like a drawer finding its track. If pity is the price of inclusion, perhaps it's time to stop paying. I stood there, hands steady at my sides, and listened to the dark until it sounded like possibility. I didn't turn my phone back on until late the next morning. The screen lit up in a pale square of light against the quiet of my kitchen, buzzing once before it settled. Messages waited in clusters, some from clients, others from family. I scrolled through without opening them, watching the names pass like passing cars on a dark road. Then I powered the phone down again and set it face down on the counter. The silence that followed was clean. Outside, snow was beginning to fall over the city. Chicago in winter has a kind of honesty to it. No disguises, no small talk. Just gray air and the sound of tires moving through slush. I made coffee, the good dark roast I saved for weekends, and stood by the window while steam fogged the glass. For once, I didn't think about what I should have said or how to fix what couldn't be fixed. I thought about the sentence my mother had said at brunch, how it landed, how it didn't, and how I had simply sat there calm as stone. By early afternoon, I was at my office, a modest space near the river with wide windows and plants that somehow survived the dry heat. My assistant Lindsay looked up from her desk. "You're in on a Sunday?" she asked, surprised, but too polite to question it. I smiled, hung my coat, and told her to go home once she finished her notes. When she left, the quiet wrapped around me again, a soft hum under the fluorescent lights. I turned on my laptop and opened the folder I had closed the night before. Rows of numbers filled the screen, years of ledgers, payments, and balances I knew better than the lines on my palm. I scrolled slowly, reading through the fine print, each line, a reminder of how deeply I had been woven into the structure of a family that never truly saw me. Every credit card payment, every property tax, every quiet repair to the cabin, all the invisible ways I had been keeping things together. It wasn't anger that moved through me now. It was something quieter, steadier, a kind of clarity that only comes after you've stopped trying to earn love that was never freely given. My therapist, Dr. Winters, had once said that clarity isn't comfort. It's just light in a room that's been dark too long. And when the light comes on, you finally see the mess. I made a list on a yellow pad, my handwriting careful and even. At the top, I wrote 3 words, "No more pretending." Under that, I listed what needed to change: my roles, my access points, the responsibilities I carried that no one acknowledged. I wrote until the daylight thinned and the city lights flickered on across the water. When I finally stopped, the page looked like a quiet revolution. I sat back in my chair and thought of my grandmother. I could almost hear the soft creak of her porch rocker, the sound of lake water brushing the dock. She used to tell me that peace was not the same as quiet. Quiet just means no one's talking, she'd say. Peace means you finally stopped listening to the wrong voices. That evening, I called Sarah Goldstein, my attorney. Her voice came through steady calm, as if she had been expecting the call. I asked about the cabin, the trust, the boundaries of what I could and couldn't control. She promised to prepare the paperwork and reminded me gently that intention mattered as much as legality. "You're not cutting them out," she said. "You're reclaiming your own ground." After we hung up, I opened the family's shared accounts one by one. My fingers didn't tremble. I reviewed statements, changed permissions, and created a new set of files that only I could access. When I finished, I leaned back and exhaled. The office was dark, except for the laptop glow, and the hum of the radiator filled the space like distant music. I made tea and carried it to the window. From up here, the river looked like a slow-moving sheet of glass. Traffic rolled across the bridges, headlights reflecting in streaks of gold. Somewhere below, people hurried to dinners and shows bundled in scarves against the wind. My own life, I realized, had always been moving beneath theirs, steady, invisible, necessary. For the next few days, I worked quietly. I reorganized files, met with clients, and answered messages with the professionalism that had become second nature. I didn't mention the brunch or the changes I was making, but every time I logged into another account and saw how deeply I'd been woven into my family's finances, I felt the same mixture of disbelief and relief. Disbelief that they had given me so much authority without noticing, and relief that I finally knew what to do with it. By Thursday, everything was in motion. I had secured new passwords, created backups, and scheduled a locksmith for the cabin. My attorney's documents were waiting for review. I felt oddly calm, as if some inner current had slowed to a manageable rhythm. That calm lasted until Saturday morning when my phone buzzed across the table. 3 missed calls from James, 2 from my mother, 1 from my father. I didn't answer. The silence stretched for an hour before the texts began. James's message arrived first. My card was declined at dinner with investors. Call me immediately. Then my mother. Carol, what have you done? And Amanda. Mom is panicking. Please fix this. I read each one slowly, like studying handwriting in an old letter. Then I set the phone down and went back to my coffee. The snow outside had started again, thin and steady falling without urgency. By evening, there were 12 missed calls and 7 new messages. None asked if I was all right. None wondered if something had happened. Every word was about inconvenience image control. I answered with a single text, I'm well. I've made some necessary changes to the account access. I'll explain more once things are properly arranged. The responses came within minutes, angry, incredulous, full of threats and guilt. I muted the conversation and turned my phone face down. The kettle clicked off in the kitchen. I poured water over a fresh tea bag and felt something inside me settle into place. Over the next few days, the calls didn't stop. They multiplied. By the 3rd morning, I had 47 missed calls and 100 unread texts. James showed up at my office without an appointment. When security called to ask if he should be allowed up, I told them no. He made a scene in the lobby before being escorted out. My hands didn't shake when I signed the incident report. The next day, my mother tried the same thing at my condo. The doorman called to confirm my standing instruction, no unannounced visitors, even family. I could hear her voice in the background, sharp, commanding, incredulous. The sound faded as she left. That night, I sent the doorman a thank you card and a small envelope with a restaurant gift certificate inside. By the end of the week, the panic had shifted to outrage. Rumors began circulating through my father's office. My brother told anyone who would listen that I had gone rogue. My mother called it a breakdown. I didn't answer, and I didn't correct them. I went to work, kept my meetings, went home, and slept well for the first time in years. One evening, while reviewing project files, I received an email from Walter Pierce, the family's longtime lawyer. He requested an urgent conversation regarding financial matters. I forwarded it to Sarah, who replied within minutes. Let him know all future communication goes through me. It was a single line, but it felt like a wall finally standing where there had only been an open door. That night, I stood on my balcony overlooking the lake. The water was black and still broken only by the faint glow of distant buoys. The air smelled of snow. I wrapped my sweater tighter and thought about how strange it was to feel both alone and completely safe for the first time. The following week, the tone of the messages began to change. Anger softened into negotiation. My father's voicemail was measured, his voice tired. Whatever this is about, we can talk it through. Call me. My mother's texts turned sugar-coated, mixing guilt with charm. Amanda pleaded for peace. James sent half-hearted apologies wrapped in accusation. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I took long walks after work, cooked simple dinners, and spent evenings reading beside the window. My therapist noticed the difference immediately during our next session. "You seem lighter," she said. I smiled and told her the truth. I finally stopped waiting for permission to be okay. When I left her office, the late afternoon light was turning gold over the river. I walked to my car without looking at my phone. The city felt different, quieter somehow, though nothing around me had changed. 2 days later, a new message arrived, this one from my father's business partner, Howard Jenkins. His email was smooth, diplomatic, the kind of tone that fills boardrooms and keeps tempers at bay. He offered to facilitate a family discussion, calling himself a neutral third party. It was a clever approach, one my father would have approved of. I read it twice before replying. "Thank you, Howard. This isn't a business dispute. It's a personal boundary. I'm open to a meeting with representation present. Please contact my attorney to arrange details." By the next morning, Sarah called. The family had agreed to mediation at her office, neutral ground professional, setting a clear framework. The meeting was set for 4 weeks from that day. I thanked her and marked the date on my calendar in a small, neat circle. That night, I stood again by the window with a cup of tea and watched the snow fall over the lake. Each flake vanished into the dark water, quiet and sure of where it was going. I thought about what it meant to finally stop fighting for a seat at a table that had never offered room. In the glass reflection, my own face looked different. Not harder, not colder, just certain. I turned off the light, leaving only the lake and the city below. Somewhere out there, my family was preparing their next move, trying to make sense of a world where I no longer played my old role. I set the cup in the sink, wiped the counter, and paused with my hands on the edge of the marble, feeling its solid weight beneath my palms. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the radiator and the faint pulse of traffic below. For the first time, I didn't dread what came next. I was ready for it. The snow kept falling slow and deliberate, erasing the footprints on the street, until everything looked untouched again. The day of the meeting arrived with a sky the color of pewter and the kind of cold that settled quietly into your bones. I left my condo early, the city still half asleep, streets shining with a thin layer of frost. The drive downtown was calm, almost serene, the kind of silence that comes before something inevitable. Sarah's office occupied the 27th floor of a building near the river, its glass walls reflecting the gray morning light. When I stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of citrus and paper, professional, neutral, intentional. She greeted me with that steady expression of hers, a hand on my shoulder, brief but grounding. "Everything's ready," she said. "Take your time before they arrive." I walked to the conference room. The space was elegant and restrained, a long mahogany table, a row of leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows that made the Chicago River look like a moving pane of silver glass. Across from where I'd sit, the skyline rose in clean lines and quiet authority. Judge Kathleen Barrow, the mediator, was already there. She stood when I entered, extending a hand. "Ms. Sullivan, I'm here to make sure we stay on track today. You set the tone." Her voice carried the kind of calm that fills a courtroom after order is restored. I nodded, grateful for it. We reviewed the agenda, simple guidelines, nothing surprising, and then waited. The clock ticked toward 2. My pulse stayed even. I had rehearsed this meeting in my mind, not the words, but the way I wanted to feel: calm, clear, present. When the receptionist called to say my family had arrived, I caught Sarah's eye. She gave a small nod, the kind that says, "You've already done the hard part." They entered together. My father first, his posture crisp and unreadable, followed by my mother, with her chin lifted, pearls gleaming beneath the fluorescent light. James trailed behind, jaw-tight expression, impatient. Amanda walked last, eyes darting toward me and then away. Walter Pierce, our longtime family lawyer, closed the door behind them, his briefcase swinging from one hand like a peace offering no one had asked for. For a moment, no one spoke. The faint hum of the heating system filled the silence. My mother finally sat, smoothing her skirt with deliberate grace. "Well," she said, glancing around the table. "Let's get this over with." Kathleen began, her tone firm, but even. "We're here to create understanding, not argument. Each person will have time to speak without interruption. We'll focus on facts, not feelings." My father gave a short nod. James leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Kathleen turned to me. "Carol, you requested this session. Please begin." I unfolded the notes I'd brought, but didn't look down. 3 weeks ago at brunch, my mother said something that made clear what I've felt most of my life, that I'm included in this family out of pity, not respect. My mother inhaled sharply, but Kathleen raised a hand. "Let her finish." I continued, keeping my tone steady. That comment was the last piece of a pattern that's existed for years. I've managed parts of the family trust, corrected mistakes, paid for repairs, and maintained properties without recognition or gratitude. I've done it because I believed in responsibility. But what I received in return was dismissal. James scoffed softly. My father's eyes dropped to the table. I reached into my folder and slid a set of documents toward the center. "These are records of family expenses, property taxes, and business adjustments I've handled. I brought them not as a weapon, but as proof of how invisible my efforts have been." James leaned forward, voice sharp. "So what is this extortion? You lock up the accounts because your feelings got hurt." Kathleen turned to him. "Mr. Sullivan, you'll have a chance to respond. Please allow her to finish." I looked at my brother. "No, James. I'm not holding anything hostage. I'm holding myself accountable for continuing to enable a dynamic that hurts everyone." My mother's voice broke through, brittle and high. "We gave you everything: schools, opportunities, connections, and this is how you thank us. By humiliating your family." I met her gaze. "You gave me a foundation, yes, but you never gave me respect. And I can't accept pity disguised as inclusion anymore." For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the hum of the heating seemed to fade. My father cleared his throat. "Carol, this isn't how families solve things. You've created chaos where none existed." "Chaos," I said softly. "Chaos is what happens when the truth finally shows up." Sarah leaned forward, slightly sliding another document across the table, a concise summary of the accounts I managed. "These are Carol's records verified against your firm's files," she said to Walter. "There's nothing fabricated here." Walter scanned the pages, his brow furrowing. "These align with what we have on record," he admitted. Though I hadn't realized how extensive Miss Sullivan's management role had become. My father's shoulders sagged just enough for me to notice. James looked from one face to another, searching for an ally. "You can't possibly think this justifies freezing the accounts." "I couldn't pay my staff last week. That's because you've been using discretionary cards tied to personal trust funds," Sarah said evenly. "Access that was granted as a courtesy, not entitlement." James's face flushed. My mother turned toward my father, her voice low but sharp. "Do something." But my father didn't. He looked at me, instead really looked the way he used to when I was small and asking questions about how buildings stood upright. "You've done all this quietly," he said. "All these years?" "Yes," I replied. "Because I thought it might make you proud." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that carries a weight no one wants to claim. Kathleen finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "This seems to be about acknowledgement as much as structure. Carol, what outcome are you hoping for?" I want boundaries, I said simply. I want recognition of what I've contributed and an end to the pattern where my worth is measured by how useful I am. I'll continue managing the trust, but with formal recognition and oversight. And the cabin remains my property. Its use will be by request with shared maintenance costs. Amanda shifted in her seat, her voice quiet but clear. That seems fair? My mother turned toward her startled. Fair? She's dividing us with paperwork. Amanda's expression softened. Maybe she's just tired of being treated like she doesn't matter. The room stilled again, softer this time. Kathleen nodded. That's a reasonable proposal. I suggest we formalize it. My father leaned back, exhaling slowly. We've taken advantage of you, he said, almost to himself. The words hung in the air, small but seismic. James bristled. Dad? No, my father interrupted, his tone low but decisive. She's right. We've leaned on her without ever giving her the credit or respect she deserves. It wasn't an apology, but it was something real. I felt my throat tighten, though my voice stayed steady. That's all I wanted to be seen. My mother looked away, eyes glassy with anger or something near it. For the first time in my life, I didn't rush to soften her edges. I let the silence stand. The next 2 hours passed in measured conversation, logistics, account structures, reporting schedules. The mediator guided us through each decision, ensuring calm where tension tried to rise. When the meeting finally ended, my family gathered their coats in silence. Amanda offered me a small, tentative smile before following the others out. My father lingered near the door, adjusting his scarf. He hesitated, then turned back. Your grandmother would be proud, he said quietly. She always said you understood the meaning of wealth. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard right. She told you that? He nodded, more than once. I should have listened. He extended his hand, formal, almost awkward. I hesitated, then took it. His grip was steady, familiar, and for the first time, sincere. We have work to do, he said. When he left the room, fell still again. Sarah began gathering the documents, but I sat for a moment longer, watching the reflection of the river shimmer against the glass. My pulse had slowed, my breathing even. Outside, the clouds had begun to break thin ribbons of sunlight stretching over the skyline. It wasn't warmth yet, but it was promise. As I stepped out into the lobby, my reflection caught in the polished metal of the elevator doors. For a moment, I barely recognized the woman looking back. Steady eyes, shoulders relaxed, calm, in a way that felt earned. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. My hand didn't shake. Down in the street, traffic hummed, people hurried past, with collars turned up against the wind. I walked toward the river, the cold air biting my cheeks, and stopped on the bridge. Water moved beneath me, slow and certain, carrying away the gray of the morning. Somewhere behind me, the old life I had kept together through silence was starting to come apart. But ahead of me, something new was taking shape, quiet, steady, and entirely mine. I stood there for a long time, watching the river turn silver in the afternoon light, until the chill crept through my coat and the city lights began to blink on, one by one. The wind lifted my hair, and for the first time, I didn't feel small inside it. The meeting was over, but what it opened had only just begun. The weeks after the meeting passed quietly, though the air around everything felt rearranged. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bracing for my family's reactions. I was watching them find their own balance in a world that no longer bent around me. Winter gave way to early spring. The snow melted into streams that ran along the curbs carrying grit and small leaves toward the drains. Chicago felt lighter, washed clean. My days filled with client meetings, new proposals, and small practical joys. Evenings were quieter, books, cooking, walks by the river. The calm didn't feel empty. It felt earned. One afternoon, while reviewing new contracts at my office, my phone rang. My father's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, I hesitated, staring at the glow of it, then answered. His tone was softer than I remembered, the edges of authority replaced by something cautious. He asked if I would meet him for coffee. No lawyers, no agendas, just conversation. The following morning, we met at a cafe halfway between my office and his. It was one of those small, old places tucked beneath a row of brownstones, the kind where the floors creak and the coffee tastes the same every time. He arrived precisely on time, wearing the same wool coat I remembered from years ago. When he smiled, it was brief and uncertain. We sat by the window, the sun reaching across the table in pale streaks. For a while, he talked about work, the company's restructuring, upcoming projects, market shifts. I listened patient, knowing this was his way of finding the courage to speak about what mattered. When he finally did, his voice dropped low. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began, "about recognition and respect. I should have done better by you. Your grandmother tried to tell me that once." I watched him stir his coffee, the spoon tapping softly against the porcelain. The sound felt heavier than it should. "She told me," he continued, "that you understood what wealth really meant. Not money, responsibility, stewardship. She said it took more strength to protect something quietly than to build it loudly." I didn't hear her then. The words settled between us, fragile but real. I didn't rush to fill the silence. For once, silence was enough. When I spoke, my voice was calm. "I wasn't looking for an apology, Dad. Just acknowledgement. That means more than you know." He nodded, a faint smile ghosting across his face. "You've changed," he said. "But maybe I'm changing too." We finished our coffee without speaking much more. When he stood to leave, he looked back once through the window before walking down the street. The sight of him older, quieter, made something inside me ease. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the start of it. Over the following months, the rest of my family adjusted in their own uneven ways. James kept his distance, our contact limited to professional updates about the company. His emails were polite, sometimes even deferential. I sensed a grudging respect in the restraint of his words. Amanda reached out now and then, sending small texts about wedding details, always ending with, "Hope you're doing okay." My mother remained mostly silent, her pride too heavy to set down quickly. When she did write, it was through short formal messages, reminders about upcoming events, or clipped holiday notes. I answered with the same civility she offered, no more and no less. It was enough. In June, Amanda called asking for help. Her wedding planner had quit unexpectedly, citing creative differences. I could hear the strain in her voice. "You're the most organized person I know," she said softly. "Would you consider stepping in?" I hesitated. The idea of re-entering that orbit of working beside my mother felt risky. But Amanda's tone wasn't manipulative. It was genuine. So I agreed with clear boundaries about what I could and couldn't take on. The first meeting took place in my mother's sunroom, light slanting across white furniture and vases of fresh hydrangeas. She greeted me with careful politeness, her voice a few decibels softer than usual. For the first time, she didn't comment on my clothes or hair. We worked through the vendor lists, seating arrangements, and floral contracts. I managed logistics. She handled the aesthetic details. Days turned into weeks, and we fell into a tentative rhythm. Sometimes while reviewing schedules, I caught her watching me, eyes thoughtful, almost uncertain. One afternoon, as we adjusted the guest seating, she sighed quietly. "You know," she said, tracing a finger along the table's edge, "if you'd gone into event planning instead of marketing, we might have gotten along better." I looked up, half smiling, unsure if it was a compliment or criticism. She seemed to catch herself. "That came out wrong," she said. "What I meant is, you're good at this, at organizing, at making things work." Her voice carried a weariness I hadn't heard before. I nodded. "Thank you," I said simply. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing she had ever offered. The wedding itself was beautiful, held in late September at the Palmer House Ballroom. The room shimmered with soft light gold trim and music that swelled just enough to make conversation feel intimate. When Amanda walked down the aisle, radiant and trembling, I felt an unexpected rush of pride. After the ceremony, my mother found me near the reception entrance. She was still in her formal gown, makeup flawless, but her eyes looked softer somehow. "You did well," she said. "Everything was perfect." Her hand brushed mine briefly. Then she moved toward the dance floor, swallowed by laughter and camera flashes. I stood there for a moment, the echo of her touch lingering like a question finally answered. Later that night, Amanda approached her dress hem gathered in one hand, her face flushed from dancing. She leaned close, speaking over the music. "I was jealous of you, you know," she said, almost shy. I blinked, unsure I'd heard right. "Jealous?" She nodded. "You always seemed whole even when they didn't see you. I spent years trying to become what they wanted. It's exhausting." Her eyes glistened, not from tears, but relief. "Thank you for showing me it's okay to stop trying." The words hit deeper than I expected. I hugged her, and for the first time in our lives, it felt like two adults meeting as equals rather than siblings playing fixed roles. When the night ended, I slipped out quietly, walking through the hotel's marble corridor toward the street. The city outside was warm, alive with late-night sounds, laughter, traffic, music from somewhere unseen. I looked up at the building lights reflecting in the windows and felt something close to peace. Back at home, I poured a glass of water and sat on the balcony watching the lights of the river drift. My phone buzzed with messages, congratulations from vendors, kind words from guests, but I didn't open them. I just sat there, letting the cool night air fill the space where tension used to live. Over the next few months, the rhythm of life found a new steadiness. My company expanded into a larger office overlooking the river. I hired new staff, younger faces eager to learn. The work felt different now, more deliberate, less like proof and more like purpose. Some evenings, I'd call my father to discuss strategy for the trust, our conversations now marked by mutual respect rather than dismissal. My mother's messages, though rare, carried warmth instead of control. And Amanda sent pictures from her honeymoon, smiling in sunlight that looked real, not posed. By December, I returned to the cabin to oversee the last phase of renovations. The lake was half frozen, the surface glimmering beneath pale winter light. Inside, the scent of pine and varnish hung in the air. The new deck extended farther toward the water, sturdy and smooth. I ran my hand along the railing, the wood cool under my fingers, and thought about how far we'd come. The cabin wasn't just a property anymore, it was a boundary made visible, a promise of balance between what was mine and what I was finally willing to share. Standing there, I heard the crunch of tires on the driveway. A familiar car came into view, my father's. He stepped out, bundled against the cold, and lifted a hand in greeting. "I brought coffee," he said, holding out 2 cups. "Thought you might need a break." We stood on the deck together, sipping quietly, while the sun slipped behind the trees. The water below caught the last of the light and held it still and silver. When he finally spoke, his tone was gentle. "Your grandmother would have loved this. You kept her spirit alive here." I nodded, the weight of that truth warming me more than the coffee. "It feels like she's still here somehow." He smiled. "Maybe she is." We stood in silence, 2 generations of Sullivans finally comfortable and quiet. The cabin, the lake, the cold, all of it felt steady. For the first time, the past didn't press down like a shadow. It stood beside me finally at peace. And as dusk gathered over the water, I knew I was ready for whatever came next. The air that evening felt lighter, touched with the clean scent of pine and thawing earth. My father and I stood on the cabin deck until the last streaks of gold slipped behind the trees. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left that needed explanation. Only the quiet acknowledgement that the years of silence had finally given way to something still and real. After he drove off, the woods fell into a hush so deep I could hear the ice shift on the lake. I stayed there a long while, fingers curled around the railing, watching a single star appear above the tree line. The night didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like room for breath, for stillness, for life that could unfold without tension. The next morning, light streamed through the cabin windows, catching in the grain of the new floorboards. I made coffee and let it fill the small kitchen with its steady warmth. The world outside looked washed clean, pale mist rising off the lake. For the first time since my grandmother passed, I didn't feel the urge to prove anything, not to her memory, not to my parents, not even to myself. I opened the old cedar chest she'd left in the corner of the living room. Inside were her notebooks filled with neat handwriting and pressed leaves between the pages. One note rested on top, written in that looping hand I could recognize anywhere. "Peace is not what you find, it's what you allow to stay." I traced the letters with my finger and smiled. She had known I'd need those words someday. That afternoon, Amanda arrived with her husband. Their laughter carried across the yard before I saw them. She hugged me the moment she stepped inside, arms tight around my shoulders, her voice soft with emotion. "I needed to see you," she said. "It feels different here, like the air itself forgave us." We spent the afternoon walking the shoreline, talking about small things, her job, her garden, how quiet her new home felt without the constant approval-seeking that used to shape her days. The ease between us was new and unforced, like water finding its natural level. Before she left, she pressed a folded note into my hand. "For when you doubt how far you've come," she said. After they drove away, I sat on the steps and opened it. Inside was a photograph of us as children, both barefoot on this same porch, holding our grandmother's old teapot between us, like it was treasure. On the back, Amanda had written, "You kept us together even when none of us deserved it." The words blurred slightly in the late afternoon light, and I let them. Over the next months, the cabin became my anchor. I worked remotely from there whenever I could, waking early to the sound of loons and the soft rustle of wind through birch trees. In the evenings, I cooked simple meals, read by the fire, and wrote notes for a project I'd been quietly planning, a small nonprofit that would mentor young women starting their own businesses. Not out of rebellion or pride, but because it felt right to build something steady and kind. Sarah helped with the paperwork. "Call it whatever feels like home," she said. So I named it Eleanor's Path, after the woman who'd taught me that calm strength was not weakness. The first program launched in early spring, hosted in my office downtown. When I stood at the front of the room greeting 10 women whose faces reflected both fear and hope, I realized I was no longer trying to prove my worth. I was sharing it. My father began attending therapy at Dr. Winter's suggestion. He told me one afternoon over coffee at the same little cafe we'd met before. His tone was simple, not performative, and when he said he was proud of me, I believed it not because I needed to, but because it sounded like truth. My mother came to the cabin in May. I didn't know she was coming until I heard the crunch of gravel under her tires. She stepped out in a linen jacket and flats that sank slightly into the soft ground. For a moment, she looked uncertain, as though the place she'd once ruled by habit no longer recognized her authority. Inside, she wandered slowly, pausing at the photographs on the mantel, my grandmother, the lake at sunrise, a candid shot of Amanda and me from her wedding day. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. Her voice had lost its sharpness. It was smaller, almost fragile. I offered her tea. She accepted, holding the mug in both hands. We sat at the kitchen table in a silence that didn't sting this time. After a while, she looked out the window. "I wasn't kind to you," she said. "I thought keeping control meant keeping the family together. I was wrong." The words didn't erase the past, but they reached something deeper than apology. I nodded. "We can start from here?" I said. She smiled faintly, and for a moment she looked like the woman she might have been if life had taught her softness earlier. When she left that afternoon, she hugged me briefly, carefully, but the gesture was hers to give, and that made it enough. By early summer, the rhythms of life had settled into something whole. Work thrived, the nonprofit grew, and the cabin became a gathering place again. Friends visited on weekends. Amanda stopped by with her husband, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes just herself. Even James reached out, offering to contribute to the nonprofit's mentorship fund. His email was short and businesslike, but it carried no edge of resentment. It was progress in its quiet way. On the first anniversary of the mediation, the day everything had shifted, I invited my family for dinner at the cabin. I cooked the way my grandmother used to, filling the air with the scent of roasted herbs and bread still warm from the oven. The table was simple candles, white dishes, branches of green laid down the center. When they arrived, the air was light with spring. The evening passed without strain. Laughter found its way between stories. Even my mother, still cautious, smiled easily when Amanda spilled water while reaching for the rolls. My father offered to help with the dishes afterward, standing beside me at the sink while crickets began to sing outside. As we worked, he said quietly, "You were right to draw the line, Carol. I used to think strength meant control. Now I see it's the opposite." I handed him a towel to dry the plates. "It's never too late to learn," I said. He smiled, and we stood there in companionable quiet until the dishes were done. When the others left, I walked them to their cars, hugging each one without hesitation. The gravel crunched under their tires as they pulled away, headlights trailing through the trees. The night that followed was still and fragrant with pine. I carried a blanket to the porch and sat with a cup of tea, watching the reflection of the moon tremble across the lake. Somewhere far off, a loon called once, and the sound echoed like memory through the dark. In that silence, I thought about how much of my life had been spent trying to be heard. Now the quiet didn't feel like absence, it felt like understanding. Peace, I realized, isn't a gift someone hands you when they finally change. It's what you choose to build when you stop living for their approval. I stayed outside until the sky began to pale, until the water lost its mirror and turned to morning gray. The world felt wide again. If this story spoke to you, tell me where you're listening from, down in the comments. And if you've ever had to find peace on your own terms, share this with someone who'll understand. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, healing, and the kind of victories that whisper instead of shout. The first birds began to sing, then soft, uncertain notes rising through the trees, and I listened, smiling as the light returned.